ASD. You consider yourself to be well trained in developmental social interaction, whole models of early language and communication intervention, and you believe that there is an abundant evidence in the literature to support this approach to working with children with ASD. Your colleagues are ABA trained psychologists and paraprofessionals. It is clear that they have influenced the curriculum of the classrooms, which are staffed by special education teachers. You agree with the application of behaviorist principles to certain aspects of working with this population, specifically the use of visual schedules and picture exchange strategies for managing challenging behaviors. However, you are concerned that many skills are being taught without regard for the developmental sequence of communication, non-linguistic, linguistic, and social emotional development. So, what would your plan be to adroitly and professionally introduce your approach to intervention with young children with ASD? So, in order to professionally introduce the developmental and social interactional models for the language and communication intervention to my colleagues, we would first talk about the study of ASD language and communication intervention, and this was Kat's part here, that basically it's still in the infant stages of research. I mean, there's no really clear one direct path, and then there are multiple approaches. So I think that would kind of lead into looking at the different theories behind the different approaches. And first we talk about the behavioral approach, which is what underlies ABA. So behavioral approaches are based upon the principles of learning theory. So that is the idea that human behavior is learned and that is governed by its antecedents and its consequences. So the theories of applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, are developed to improve human behavior through directly implementing the behavior, or the principles of behaviorism. So a large component of ABA is operant conditioning, which is where behavior is altered due to the stimulus modification and the presentation of reinforcement immediately following the behavior's occurrence. So basically, you're modifying the environment to reinforce certain behaviors and to extinguish other behaviors. And research has shown that individuals with autism spectrum disorders show significant gains when instructed using the principles of ABA. One of the big intervention techniques of ABA is discrete trial instruction, or it can be referred to as discrete trial training. And it's the traditional ABA technique. It consists of 4 components: the discriminative stimulus or instruction, a response, a consequence, and then an intertrial interval, which is basically like a brief pause before you move on to the next trial. So prompting is utilized throughout the learning process. The concept is that the child will acquire the specialized skills during the training, and then when the child masters the skills in structured environments, you move on to less structured environments, and you work on generalizing the skill to more like naturalistic settings. So there are a couple studies that talk about kind of more traditional ABA intervention, and it's or the early intensive behavioral intervention. So it's working with younger children with ASD. So this EIBI program is based upon ABA, and its intensive program involves about 40 hours of one-on-one DTT intervention. So what they found in this meta-analysis was that most of the ways they measured any progress with these kids was through IQ. So, and they didn't really see many other gains in other areas, specifically communication and language, because it really wasn't measured. So there are lots of claims that, you know, these kids are significantly improving in lots of different skills, when really it's kind of, they're not really addressing language like they should. So that's kind of the outcome of this. And I like this quote, one likely explanation of this focus on IQ as the primary outcome variable in the EIBI literature is that the behavioral discrete trial training approach is perhaps best suited to teaching concrete skills as compared to spontaneous social and communication behavior. So another meta-analysis also found similar results, that mainly IQ was measured, Although they did see some expressive and receptive language and adaptive behavior improvements compared to, with this intervention compared to control groups. But only one study was a fully randomized controlled trial. So you can take that with a grain of salt.
Quick question.
Yes.
So that 2011 study strongly supported the effectiveness of the behaviorist approach, but the study before that didn't only.
They did in the fact that it does improve. There's significant improvement in IQ compared to controls, but in terms of other areas, it really wasn't measured well enough to be considered effective, or significantly effective in terms of language improvement or social communication improvement.
So this might be going too specific, but were these, because they're both meta-analyses, were they looking at the same 11 studies and like drawing different conclusions, or were they looking at like different studies?
No, so they had different criteria, inclusionary criteria, but some of them did overlap, but not all of them. The 2011 one did have criteria where they measured receptive and expressive language. So they kind of had different dependent measures than the first meta-analysis. But the first meta-analysis did notice that a lot of the studies that they were finding didn't even include that as a measure. And so these claims are being made when really there's not the evidence there to prove it. With the next study, they showed that there were significant gains in IQ and communication and socialization via the domains on the BABS. And then that was compared to what's considered treatment as usual. This is their control, which could be a variety of things. They could be receiving a combination of ABA, total communication, sensory motor, all these different types of interventions. So that's like their control. So it really wasn't very specific comparisons. But they did, it was interesting because this one was based on a model in a preschool. So it was 2 preschool children in a classroom setting. And they did notice these improvements, but again, it was mainly with IQ or like vocational skills versus language skills. So there are these big issues with traditional ABA that are listed here. Studies tend to involve children with low IQs. So the research does not necessarily show that intervention is effective with all individuals. Sure, there are gains that are made for some individuals with ASD, but a lot of those that they're finding are kids who start out with low IQs, and you would really benefit most from learning those concrete skills that would boost their IQs, whereas language isn't necessarily affected as much. Another is that results are typically measured by behavioral or adaptive instruments. So meaningful improvements in social relationships and social pragmatic skills need further investigation. By the way, that was all in our book. The ASD book we had for our seminar last May. Yeah. So that information was in the behavioral section of that book. They called a chapter. Really good chapter. Yeah, I didn't write down the chapter, but those are the authors of the chapter. There's also an issue with prompt dependence, so these kids being dependent on prompts in order to do these skills they've attained. Reduced child motivation, whereas, because in behavioral therapy, you're pushing so hard that sometimes these skills and the tasks become aversive. So if the child motivation decreases, a lot of times you get an increase in, inappropriate behaviors. Then there's low maintenance and generalization of the skills. So they do great at the initial termination of the study, but if you do those follow-up studies, there isn't really that proof there to show that these skills are being maintained or generalized. And then in most of Pruzan's arguments, ABA tends to disregard a child's developmental profile. So that'll lead us into that section.
Hi guys. So we kind of wanted to give a definition for both a developmental approach and a social interactional approach. Our first definition comes from a Pruzan article that I uploaded onto our group folder. It's basically saying that developmental approach looks at the whole child instead of these singular skills that traditional ABA tends to look at. So you're looking at consideration in terms of typical and atypical development, family strengths and dynamics, and cultural diversity and appropriate practices. So that came directly from I think it's the typically developing article, part 1. Then it goes into a little bit of a definition of a social interactional approach, which I got from a review of all the different types of treatments for ASD, not necessarily just developmental and social interactional and behavioral approaches, but mixes of the two in between and other approaches that we might not be familiar with. So you can kind of read over that. It's a really long article, but I highlighted some things that you guys might not be familiar with. So the developmental social pragmatic model, or DSP, is an approach that kind of involves also a developmental approach, not necessarily looking at just social and emotional development. It really looks at the importance of starting and completing interactions with other people, and not just looking at rote behaviors of language such as saying I want, I see, I like. It looks at how a child focuses their language on what their interests are and builds on whatever they already have. So it's not only looking at the social aspect, but building upon the social aspect and their foundational skills that they already have. So it's not skipping any steps to get to this one major target goal of being able to complete social interactions with grammatically correct sentences. There are obviously steps that we have to take beforehand to get these primary foundational skills of language and interaction that we have to take before getting to communication amongst our peers and amongst adults. One study by Del Prado kind of looked at discrete trial, which is our comparison of behavioral aspect to normalized behavioral language intervention for young kids with autism. So it looked at 8 different studies. I'm not sure if there may have been